thousands of comments, and many, many comments with this idea of people without inner speech are NPCs. I don't know if you know what an NPC is, but non-playable character in video games. Like, it's a zombie, basically. And obviously, I think that's wrong and ridiculous. But I was curious to get your thoughts on why exactly that notion is so wrong.
So this is where people are doing inner speech in the scanner, not because they've been told to, but just because they're doing inner speech in that moment, and we've captured it using DES. You get something very different. You get very little activation in Broca's area at the front. You get much more activation further back in the brain in that area, that temporal area that we associate with speech comprehension. So it's as if, or speech, receiving speech. So it's as if elicited inner speech is more of a directed, speaky kind of thing, and spontaneous inner speech is more of a kind of comprehending, listen-y kind of thing. But actually, that's going beyond the data. We can't conclude that. We don't have enough controls, other areas of regions of interest, and so on. It's preliminary findings, but that are nevertheless really suggestive in just making us stop and think. That's that word again. Stop and consider when we ask somebody to do something in the scanner on purpose, deliberately, is it actually anything like the kind of thing that happens that we're really interested in, which is what happens to people spontaneously in their heads?
So I guess the question that comes to mind, maybe for the listener, is, are we being pedantic over these labels? Does it matter if it's inner speech or unsymbolized thinking or some other form of abstract conceptual cognition? Are there actual implications for an individual who is innerly speaking 80% of the time versus 20% of the time? Do those differences actually show up day to day for these people?
I think there are those differences. We need to be on our guard against being drawn back into this question of whether we need language for thinking. Because some people use inner speech a lot. That doesn't make them smarter. It just means they're doing things one way and other people are doing it another way. So I think we can avoid those questions. And the implications are that if you're using inner speech, you're doing it because you're able to make use, or you're enjoying, or you're finding benefit from making use of this cool tool that you've got available to you. When we look at how inner speech develops in childhood, again, going back to Vygotsky's theory, his insight was that inner speech develops through a developmental process, which begins with social speech, which begins with babies and young children being in social dialogues with others, primarily their caregivers, parents and caregivers. Those dialogues between the small child and the parent gradually become internalized, and they form the stage that we now call private speech. And this is where you see kids talking to themselves out loud as they're working on a task, as they're playing, as they're just dreaming and being creative and mind wandering and whatever. And then the idea is that there's another stage of development which leads to that stuff becoming completely internalized. So it's going on totally silently. And that's the inner speech that many of us recognize in adulthood. Now, we do know that kids who use more of a particular kind of inner speech, particularly a particular kind of private speech, the more of the self-regulatory type. So when you see kids who are talking themselves through a problem and using words to guide themselves, we do see some connections with performance. We do see that those kids seem to be benefiting from that kind of speech because they're solving the task quicker. They're solving the puzzle quicker, for example. We also see these huge individual differences between kids. So you could argue that you would expect to see some cognitive effects of people in adulthood using more inner speech compared to those who are using less. And I think people are starting to ask those questions empirically. they come with huge problems. One is the way that we assess inner speech and just giving people questionnaires. And you've been through DES, you know how detailed and sophisticated a method it is. Simply saying, oh, let's not bother with all that. Let's just fill in this questionnaire. It probably wouldn't satisfy you very much in terms of what the insight that it had given into your mind. It certainly doesn't satisfy me. Having said that, questionnaires are pretty handy. They're quick and easy to use, so we use them. So there's a question of how you assess the inner speech, but also there's a danger of just lumping all different kinds of inner speech together. So if I asked you, who are the cleverest people you know? And then I said, are they the people who talk the most? You'd think that was a really dumb question, right? Because some people talk a lot. Some people don't say very much at all. It's not something you particularly correlate with intelligence or otherwise. And asking the same question about inner speech is really just as misguided. Is it just a lot of inner speech versus not so much inner speech? Really, the question we should be asking is, what kind of inner speech are people using? What forms is it taking? What functions are those different forms mapping onto? And then we'll build up a better profile of how somebody is using inner speech. And then the next sort of second bit to the answer is, inner speech is not always a positive thing. Inner speech can be really pernicious. And we can use words, as I've already said, to beat ourselves up, to punish ourselves, to criticize ourselves. And we do that. We do that quite a bit. And some people do that more than others. And for some people, inner speech is a real burden. It's a real weapon that they're using against themselves. And in contexts like depression and anxiety, we call it rumination. We call it excessive thinking, brooding on a particular topic in words, which is really just a kind of negative inner speech. So you can kind of understand why some people, when I give talks on this topic, there's always somebody who comes up to me and says, I practice meditation and I'm trying to silence the inner voices. And I'm like, okay, well, if your inner voices are bothering you, then that sounds like a pretty good idea. But just be aware that inner speech comes in all these different forms and it has all these different valences. And maybe another approach would be to say, let's make the most of the positive inner speech and use it. And let's try and cut out the more negative stuff.
Yes. Yeah, it's a good point. We think a lot about frequency of inner speech, but maybe a much more important dimension is content. I think there's as you say, mind wandering has pretty bad associations with mental health in general. That's default mode network activity. Mind wandering is generally associated with negative mental health outcomes. Not necessarily the case for everybody, but in general, that's the case. I was speaking to, did you ever collaborate with Gualtiero Piccinini? No, he was a collaborator of Russ, and he did the DES interviews with me. He has aphantasia and 0 samples of inner speech, and he's a consciousness philosopher. So, right away, sort of just dispels any notion you might have of, you need inner speech to be doing any sort of complex thinking. You think of a philosopher, like what's their job is to, kind of think through weird and abstract problems. And apparently you don't need inner speech for that, because even Russ, who is incredibly skeptical of people who report having no inner speech, admitted that there was no samples that Gualtiero had with inner speech. I think a comment that I get a lot, which annoys me, is that video with Russ went really viral for the channel, has over 300,000 views and has thousands of comments. And many, many comments with this idea of people without inner speech are NPCs. I don't know if you know what an NPC is, but non-playable character in video games. Like, it's a zombie, basically. And obviously, I think that's wrong and ridiculous. But I was curious to get your thoughts on why exactly that notion is so wrong.
The notion that some people have no inner speech, or the idea that as a result their minds are empty in some way, that they're zombies.
Yeah, exactly. The idea that if someone doesn't have inner speech, they are a zombie.
Well, I think I've answered that. I think people use inner speech because it's there for most people and it's pretty handy. but it is not compulsory, and some people don't use it. It's hard to know who those people are because questionnaires are not reliable in this context. I'd say if you found somebody who has 0 samples on a good series of DES interviews, then that's a pretty good sign that they've got no inner speech. But there's no way that you then conclude that there's nothing going on in their minds. I mean, that's just going back to the old equating thinking with language. Of course, there's plenty going on. I mean, if you want proof, just, find the nearest 12-month-old baby and see what they're capable of doing. See what they are, the extraordinary intelligence they are demonstrating. 12 months is an age when language is starting to get going for most babies. So pick an earlier date if you want, but when language hasn't got going. They're still doing incredible things. Or talk to the family dog or your local friendly bonobo or whoever, and you'll see humans, you'll see other animals doing extraordinarily clever things without language. So that's one reason why this question is just a non-starter. I don't know why we've become so obsessed with this idea of total lack of inner speech. I'm in a way, I'm pleased because it means people are talking about inner speech now in a way that they weren't 10 years ago. I think it's good in that it is emphasizing the variability in inner speech. I think it is not good in the way it seems to be creating a new psychiatric or neurological condition, which I'm extremely uneasy about. I don't think we need that. I don't think it's accurate. I don't think we've got good data on it. I think we can focus instead on the huge variety. The way that people differ both within themselves, within their own experience, but also differ from other people, and try and understand that and celebrate that.
Yes.
So you're right. There's been an awful lot of heat on the internet about this question, which ultimately has stemmed from Russ's work on descriptive experience sampling in a kind of roundabout way. But some of it isn't particularly productive. I hope it gets channeled into these more interesting questions of not how much inner speech you use, but what kinds of inner speech you use.
Yes.
Because, that's what you'd say about another person. You wouldn't say, how much do they talk? You'd say, what do they say with their words? What do they do with their words? That's what tells you about the person.
Yeah. I think it's insane. And again, this wasn't just a small amount of people. This was hundreds of people. And it shows that if one person's inner experience is a particular way, we have a strong bias to assume that everyone else has the same profile of inner experience. And if I learned anything from descriptive experience sampling, it is exactly that could not be further from the truth. And that fact is beautiful. We vary in an impossibly large amount of dimensions, like dimensions we don't even know exist. And I think that is the coolest thing in the world. But while that's so obvious to me now, maybe it wasn't as obvious before I started descriptive experience sampling. So many people just refuse to believe this is the case at all. And it's the same with aphantasia. If someone is a very dominant visual imaginer, they just refuse to believe that other people aren't like that. So many comments of, I absolutely refuse to believe that aphantasia exists. It's a myth. I even got a comment today saying aphantasia is a myth. They absolutely, completely refuse to believe that other people's experience of the world could be different than theirs. And that's just kind of blows my mind. It's like, how can you be that confident? It's just a ridiculous, especially because they clearly didn't watch my episode with Russ, because the one thing that he keeps highlighting again and again is that people don't really understand their own inner experience. Their self-reporting is often very wrong, and that people vary in all of these ways that we didn't know even existed. But even with that, just comment after comment, and I'll put up a bunch on the screen. It was wild. And some of them got thousands of likes, of people. I inner speak all the time. I do this from inner speaking. How can they even function as human beings without this? Like the fact that there's any sort of alternate strategy that someone could develop throughout their life to do these tasks. It was just a completely impossible idea to them. Why do you think that is? I mean, this is such a strange such a strange one. It's like the human brain is the most complex system in the known universe. It varying a bit in we experience the world surely is not that crazy a thing to understand.
You'd think, wouldn't you? I'm also having published a book on this topic, 10 years ago now. Where are all these people when my book was coming out? Because, all these people who are fanatical about inner speech, they weren't around then.
Yeah.
It's a sign of how things have changed. And I think it's thanks to the work of people like Russ that's really, really careful. I mean, he's one of the most interesting, it's pretty much the most interesting scientist I know in the way that he has gone about just carefully describing what is there and ploughing this furrow totally against all other trends and streams. And, he's just pursued this goal in an extraordinary way, which I think has led to real benefits for our understanding of ourselves. So there's a question of why has this come to light just now? And it is in the last 5 years that it's happened, since that tweet went viral. And it is something to do with people latching on to, it's almost like seeing something that was always there. I felt when I was writing my book and publishing the book that people were just so familiar with this thing. They they had all these assumptions about it and they didn't really think about it. And the book did help, I think, some people to look at their own minds anew. And it really, the nicest thing that people said to me about the book, and I had this comment a lot, which was, you made me, for a few days, I just couldn't function because I was just focusing on my own thoughts and thinking, oh, is that dialogic inner speech? Is that condensed inner speech? And then I came out at the end of that little wobble and found I was enjoying my own mind so much more. And that was a lovely thing for people to say. And I think that, Russ's work has really helped with that. There's something in the air about it at the moment to do with maybe just a recognition that we can have a science of this. When I was starting out, people would say, you can't study inner speech. It's not science. You can't put it under a microscope. You can't measure it. It's not observable. And I kind of blithely carried on anyway. And other people around the world were doing, a very small number of people working on this. But the graph of papers published on inner speech is just on a steady upwards incline in the last 10 years or so. So it's happening in the scientific research. That's helping people to understand that you can be scientific about this stuff. You can say meaningful things about it. It's all good in helping us to be more specific about what the mind does, to know our own minds better, to know other people's minds better. And I think, as you say, there's a real problem of stigma. There's a real problem of people making judgments about other people's minds on the basis of their own minds. That's not healthy, really, socially, is it?
Yes, exactly.
But I think it's also revealing that our minds are a mystery to ourselves as well, and revealing some of that mystery and helping us to be at home in that mystery. And I think that can only be positive in a well-being sense, to have a better idea of what you can expect to be in your mind, all the weird and crazy stuff that is going to go on in your mind. Not to be frightened about it, not to be worried about it, just to accept it as part of the wonderful pageant of consciousness. And to be a bit kinder on yourself as a result. I think that's a real, blow to, for increased well-being.
Yeah. Well said. I have so many thoughts on that. I guess one, we've seen this massive increase in the term neurodiversity, right? And not usually in reference to inner speech. It's mostly in relation to ADHD and autism, which have kind of also blown up as labels in the last sort of 5-10 years. But I guess to go back to echo your earlier point on the power of language, I think now that neurodiversity is so common amongst in our vocabularies, maybe we are thinking about all these other ways that people can be neurodiverse. Now, I kind of believe that there's not really anything as typical there's no such thing as neurotypical. We can all find ways that we vary. But possibly the fact that neurodiversity has become such a big trend, and that's just increased and exploded everywhere, and there's neurodiversity programs everywhere, that inner speech and aphantasia. I think aphantasia is also exploding. are kind of piggybacking on this trend of realizing that we're quite different. And I think kinder to yourself is a big implication of it, but it's also, I think, made me a lot more empathetic towards others. And if I'm having an argument, not really an argument, but a disagreement with somebody, and we're not seeing things the same way, now I think about it as in, oh, we're just really not actually seeing it the same way. Where I'm saying things with my words and I have this model of what my words mean, they just might have a completely different interpretation of what those words mean. If I'm saying, imagine this, it's like this, and I have this image in my head, and I'm like, why can't they say the image? Well, maybe they don't see images, or maybe they don't see images in the way that I see images. There's just so many ways that people vary, and I just think it's unbelievably cool.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel